Gathering the Nations with Jessica Arianes.
All right, this is the presentation portion of our study tonight. I am going to review Exodus chapter 15, 22 through 17, verse 22 through chapter 17, and it's titled Sustenance in the Wilderness. This is the beginning of the children of Israel's relationship, or Yahweh's relationship with the children of Israel. It's only been a few months, so they are not accustomed to his leading. And therefore, we see the importance of Moshe being an intermediary, acting on behalf of Yahweh for their sake. And so the beginning of Exodus details the Israelites' journey through the wilderness after leaving Egypt, highlighting several instances of divine provision and the people's struggling faith. Now, the first account describes the transformation of bitter water into sweet water at Marah, followed by their arrival at a place of abundance. Next, the text recounts the miraculous provision of bread from heaven, known as manna, and then quail, demonstrating again Yahweh's sustenance despite the Israelites' grumbling and disobedience. And so this really is supposed to point to Yahweh's faithfulness, not so much Israel's lack of faith. So what's particular here is that it's during this time that Yahweh institutes the observing of the Sabbath rest. Finally, the passage recounts the provision of water from a rock at Rephidim after the people again complained, and a subsequent battle where the Israelites were victorious when Moshe held up his hands. These events illustrate Yahweh's power and faithfulness in meeting the needs of his people while also testing and establishing his laws among them. All right, so we've already gone over Exodus chapter 15, 16, and 17. We are beginning with verse 22, and I will give you just a breakdown of the verses and then some commentary on those verses. So in 15, the children of Israel depart from the land of Mitzrayim. Soon after leaving Mitzrayim, Moshe leads Israel from the Sea of Reeds. They travel for 3 days in the wilderness of Shur and find no water. So it's there after immediately following day 3, they arrive at Marah, but are unable to drink the water because it's bitter. And so this is the first account of them grumbling against Moshe. So they're traveling. First location, no water. Second location, bitter water. So again, they're faced with obstacles. They're faced with limitations and what seems to be impossibilities, and they begin to question their livelihood. Now, we have to also keep in mind that they are not accustomed to having Yah as their El. Remember, they're coming out of Egypt, where the pharaohs and their gods were considered the source of provision. As they worshipped and sacrificed to their gods, they would then experience abundance, and Egypt was an abundant state. And so this is a total conversion of mind. This is a transformation that's required. And so again, Yah is allowing these situations to come upon them. He's guiding them, specifically leading them, and he has orchestrated their trials and their testing. And again, it's not to prove their weakness, but to prove his strength and sovereignty. It's opportunities for Yah to reveal himself to the children of Israel. And it's, again, as we have mentioned in our chat, that this is about building and establishing a relationship to relate to Yah as their Elohim. He is becoming their Elohim. All right. So here the people grumble against Moshe. The waters in that particular region were brackish. Brackish means slightly salty due to a mixture of river water and sea water. So what's important here is that we see the result of this brackish, salty water is because of mixing. It's not pure, clean water. There's a mixture going on there. Now, the Hebrew word Marah means is a word that can be used to describe the results of continued fighting. A person who is faced with constant opposition, oppression, or lack can develop a hardness of heart, especially when that person loses hope or sees no way out. The heart can become hard, which is really the underlying threat in this situation. It's not even the lack of water. It's not the lack of food. It's not those who contend against us. It's not the environment that is posing the real threat. The real threat is how if we allow the heart to become hardened. And so it's important to note here, again, continued fighting, 2 Samuel 2:26. This word marah can also be used metaphorically to modify a cry or a mourning. Moshe consistently cried out unto Yahweh, and I'm sure that his cry was likened to a child that is dependent upon its parent for substance or for, nourishment. And so the cry is responded to immediately by Yahweh. Whereas the children, when Marah is present in the heart or in the soul, when the soul has become salty or the soul has become bitter, then the cry is a bitter cry of resentment, of a lack of contentment. There is it's a demand and a charge against the parent, a charge against the provider. So again, there is a difference between crying out as a child who has met a desperate situation and then someone who is charging with contempt. And so this word marah in the Hebrew can also represent a characteristic of death in 1 Samuel 15:32. It also describes a person as hot-tempered, discontented, provoked, anguished, or ruthless. Now, an instance of this word as bitter water determined the legal status of a woman accused of infidelity. This was holy water that was combined with dust from the tabernacle floor and ink, her charges as they were written, and then was ingested by the accused. Now, the water was literally bitter and would produce bitterness or punishment if the woman were found guilty. So we see that bitter water is a judgment. And we can see that it produces, what does it produce? Hot-tempered, right? It's an attribute of death, characterized by death, nothing living, nothing flowing. So if this is signifying the hardness of the heart, then that is a characteristic of death. And then we see the byproduct or this salty water flowing through or causing the heart to be shriveled or pruned up will cause hot-tempered, discontent, easily provoked, anxiety, anguish, ruthless behavior. It comes from this place. Infidelity, all right? Now, in verse 25, we're still in Exodus 15, verse 25, and it says here that the same day that they arrived at Marah, Moshe cries out. So again, we see that contrast. The children cry out, but their cry is a bitter accusation. It's almost accosting and charging Yahweh with contempt. Whereas Moshe cries out and he seeks Yahweh with his cry. He seeks direction. He seeks clarity. He seeks provision. So we see that there is a healthy connection here with Moshe. But we also remember that Moshe was pruned and prepared in his own season of isolation. And in that place of isolation is where he developed his dependency on Yahweh when he was sent out of Egypt. And it's there he learned to communicate. And this is his confidence. This is his surety that he knows in his being that Yahweh not only hears him, but in time and in Yah's way, he will provide. He will make a way for him. So Moshe cries out from this place. And it's then that Yahweh shows him a tree. Then the solution comes. And when he tells him, throw that branch into the water, and when he does, those bitter waters become sweet. The impossible becomes possible. There, he makes a statute and an ordinance in order to prove the children. There's something significant here because this act leads to Yahweh establishing a statute and an ordinance. And these statutes and ordinances have a purpose. It's not just to be robotic and to subjugate your will as a slave. It's about obedience working through the will of the individual so that the will of the soul of the individual can experience the blessings of obeying Yah, doing his will. There is a blessing there. Okay. And so before we move on, we're going to look at water. So what did this bitter water symbolize? Well, the water in this case would symbolize the Ruach of Elohim that heals. We know that because there in Elim, it's where Yahweh reveals himself as Yahweh Rapha. I'll give you another example that points to Yahusha as we look back and forward. We can see in Yahuchanan or John chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, the pool of Bethesda. Now there's lots of examples of the living water or the water of life, but I want to give you an example, this example here, because this word for Bethesda, house, and then the second word is mercy. So Bethesda translates as the house of mercy, and it also translates as flowing or living water. And the verse reads, for an angel or melachim went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled or stirred up the water. So even though it was a pool, it wasn't running water, streams of water, but it was oxygenated and it was stirred up. And that's what makes it flowing, living waters, that it has breath, it has oxygen in the molecule, the water molecule. So this melachim goes in, stirs up the water. And the verse reads, whosoever then first, after the stirring up of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. The man was made whole. Now it's interesting because in this case, Yahusha says to the man, do you desire, do you want to be made whole? And then he explains his circumstances. He gives a report of his limitations and the impossibility of being healed. But Yahusha testifies of the possibility and commands him, speaks to him, and says, pick up your bed and walk. But there's a contingency to maintain his healing. A few verses later, he tells the man, go and sin no more. So going back to these bitter waters and the transformation of those bitter waters into sweet waters, while just a few verses later, again, Yahweh reveals himself after he gives the statutes and ordinances as Yahweh Rapha, the one who heals. Go and sin no more. So then sin, as we see developing, is defined. It's not defined so much here, but we are going to see sin will soon be defined based on Yah's statutes, ordinances, his laws. And those who violate the laws, those who violate his statutes and his ordinance, will now be guilty of sin as it's defined. Now, this is the argument that Paul has. This is his controversy when he says, before the law was given, I didn't know I was sinning because there was no law against it. But once the law went into effect and it was established as a statute or an ordinance, well, then I was guilty of my sin. So the law, he says, is the law not good? No, God forbid. The law is good. but the law is what says this is sin. So here's the case. The house of mercy, right? So Yahweh is in fact saying to the children of Israel, I am this one who even the waters are transformed to bring healing and restoration. But there's more to this because, again, he institutes his statutes and his ordinances. Let's look. And it says here to prove them. Now, in verse 26, Yahweh makes a law and a right ruling for the people. And it's this that tests them. Okay, it's to test them. He says, now let's focus on the details here, right? If you will diligently hearken to the voice of Yahweh your Elohim, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, he will put none of these diseases upon you, which he has brought upon the Egyptians, for I am Yahweh Rapha, or Yahweh Rapha, the El that heals you. So healing is the reward of being obedient. So he's saying, we're going to enter into this covenant, and here's the foundation of my relationship with you and what I require of you. But I am who I am. He's saying, I am who I am. I do what I do, right? But in order to maintain your healing, it requires your obedience. Remember, he said to the man, YHUH said, go and sin no more. Pick up your mat and walk. All right, so he tells the man, go and sin no more. So again, Yahweh is establishing a foundational relationship as part of the covenant. It's not just about do what I say, do what I say. It's about that covenant relationship that he's going to have with the children of Israel. So the water symbolizes the Ruach of Elohim that heals. Now again, in verse 26, Yahweh makes a law and a right ruling for them, and he tests them there. So again, healing is the reward for being obedient to the covenant relationship. That is to know him. From there, we learn to rest in him. If you know that he's all sufficient, all powerful, then you learn to rest in his sovereignty. You learn to rest in his grace. And as you are resting in him and his will being accomplished in you, this then establishes you by faith. And as your faith is established, you can then receive all that he has for you. So this is the process in which he develops a relationship with us. He says, get to know me so that you can rest in me, be assured, and receive of me. What a good El we serve. So let's look at some of these definitions from a legal perspective. Now, remember, there were no laws, there were no commandments, there were no statutes given quite yet. But there was the law of right ruling, or to do what is right. The spirit of Elohim moved upon certain individuals, giving them the option to err or to do what is right. We see this with Cain. If you do what is right in my eyes, will you not be accepted? So we know that this was from the beginning. There was always the option, if you eat from this tree, you shall die. To choose to do what is right. So let's look. So the first thing we see here is he gave to them in verse 26 a statute and an ordinance. Let's look at the statute and what it means here. It is the Hebrew word chok, and it means basically an expectation that is to be enacted as a custom. As I mentioned earlier, it is a custom in my home that we eat our meals at the dinner table and that we spend that time together to relax, to recline, to repose from the day, and to connect. So this is a custom that's enacted at dinner time. So a statute is something that will be expected of you to continually do as a custom among your people. But the statute in this case, from a legal perspective, is given as a mandate. That's why you'll see the statute and ordinance. They're not two different things. I mean, they are, but the statute was given by ordinance. And we'll define that in just a second, making it more than just a custom or a tradition, but rather a mandate that is now prescribed by the decree. Now, a decree is just basically another word for ordinating something, or an ordinance, right? Does that make sense? So it's an expectation to be enacted as a custom. And from a legal perspective, it is given when it's given as a mandate, then it would be prescribed by a decree. All right, a decree is also an ordinance. So what is ordinance in this case? Now, the word ordinance is mishpat. Many are mishpatim, but in this case, the ordinance, mishpat. And a mishpat, or an ordinance or a decree, is a piece of legislation enacted as a verdict. So a judgment or a decree, a declaration. So, for example, by order of, ordinance, by order of, to render judgment as a lawful decision. All right, we're getting somewhere, okay? So he says, I will put none of the diseases upon you, and I will be a healer to you. So what is the decree? So a decree is something decided. Now remember, decree and ordinance, basically the same, but we're looking at it from a judicial perspective. Yah is acting as a judge in this case, or a lawgiver or lawmaker, and he's establishing something on the earth among his people. So a decree, by order of the decree. So a decree, think of the word declaration. So a decree is something decided that's usually declared by council to settle a dispute or to discipline. Makes sense. That's what's happening here. So the children keep complaining, murmuring. And so Yahuwah responds by making a decree, a legal, lawful proclamation. He promulgates, and that means he exposes his law to public view. Okay? He issues, and usually decrees are issued by a head or a leader who has the authority to do so. Whenever a decree was issued by a monarch, the decree becomes a royal decree. So kings could occasionally decree the cancellation of existing debts and related transactions, because they are the ones that usually put these royal declarations or royal decrees into motion. So reflecting a statute, an expected that you behave a particular, that you do something specific, and it becomes a mandate when it's decreed. When it's decreed, that is called an ordinance. So a statute, a custom, and an ordinance, a verdict. So that means do this, and if you don't, here's the judgment. There it is. Okay, breaking it down. So we see that here. If you will do these things, then you won't receive the judgment, the mishpatim, the lawful decision against you. I decree it. Okay, it's settled. It's lawful. Now, just for our understanding, I'll give you a few more. So very similar to a decree is something called an edict. An edict is a decree or an order or an ordinance issued by a sovereign, a state, or any other holder of authority. Any formal or authoritative command, proclamation, etc. The rule of law. So remember, the rule of law is a principle that all people and organizations within a country, state, or community are held accountable to the same set of laws. That's called a rule of law. For example, the 10 Commandments. So what is a code of law? So you have law codes and code of law. Now, law codes, including the Torah, also called legal code, like the codes of Hammurabi, is a systematic collection of statutes. Remember those statutes? What are statutes? Expectations to be enacted as a custom. So law codes or legal codes are a systematic collection of statutes, expectations. It is a type of legislation that purports to exhaustively cover a complete system of laws or a particular area of law as it existed at the time the code was enacted. All right, then we have, in biblical concept, we have religious and civil law code. So we have two, we have moral and civil. Moral law codes pertains to your own obligations and conduct before Yahweh, and basically makes you accountable. You see that this would say, as an independent person, you are accountable. This requires self-reflection. When I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted like a child, I spoke like a child, but when I became full grown, I want you to see something here. So moral accountability says you do what's right. You are obligated before Yah to do what's right, okay? Just you doing what's right before him is still immature in your in your development. We develop as a mature individual, full grown, when we are adhering to the civil law codes. Let me explain. So the civil law codes pertain to the way you conduct affairs and or business with others. You still have accountability, but as a grown man, you become selfless in your consideration. So that is it. So when we are thinking only of the moral codes that pertain to us and how we conduct ourselves before Yah, we are still immature because it's only in our self-reflection. But when we come out of that self-reflection, you know, I was wrong, that we come out from that self-reflection, now we begin to see selfless consideration of others. That's what YHUH says, love Yahweh, your Elohim, the moral codes, love your neighbor as yourself, the civil codes. We see now the whole thing being encompassed by love. We see that love is what maturates the soul and causes us to also not only have the ability to self-reflect, but to consider others and how our actions might affect them. We see that maturation. That is a full-grown individual. You can reflect on your own error and even what you've done well, and you can consider the benefit of others. So what were some of the contingencies here in verse 26? He says that, again, he's creating a law and right ruling for them, and that this will become a test. It will always test them. And what we want to focus on is not the test itself, but what is the simplicity of it, and then the benefit. You see, he says, look at what you get if you do. And what is it? He says, well, if you will diligently listen. Now, if you look up that word for diligently hearken, if you look up hearken, it's the word Shema. So it's the first thing he says to the children of Israel, the first order, the first statute. It's a custom to listen to him, to hear him. And it's enacted that if you don't, there's an order of decree, a lawful decision against you, that you will experience sickness and disease. And I'll explain why. So diligently listen to Shema, the voice of Yahweh. The second thing that's in there is, he says, do what is right in his sight. Remember this concept of, if I find favor in your eyes. Let me find, whenever a subordinate confronted a magistrate or a person in authority or a higher ranking individual, and they requested or petitioned something from them, like Joseph when he petitioned Pharaoh to bury his father, he said, if I find favor in your eyes. We see this on many occasions. So it means that you have that favor is usually the result of doing what is right in their eyes. If you have erred in the eyes of somebody, it makes it more difficult for you to petition them for something, or to require of them, or to obtain something from them, especially mercy. So we see here that the second contingency of being healed or walking in this healness or abiding in this healness, is he says, if you will diligently hearken and do that which is right in his sight, find favor. And then finally he says, and keep all of my statutes. Then we see the decree, we see the ordinance. There's the decree of verdict. Otherwise, he says, the judgment of disease would come upon them. Go and sin no more. We see the accountability here. As children, he's first saying, you have to learn to self-reflect and do what is right before me. You and I, this is part of that law code, the moral, he's putting in them, moral accountability. As they mature, grow, and develop, enter into the land of Canaan, the responsibility as kings, as priests, is now you're accountable for your consideration of others. Now the laws will include crimes against others, civil laws. Does that make sense? All right. So verse 27, so we're moving on from that. So extremely important here. He's establishing with them the basic tenets of their relationship, their covenant relationship with him, which is moral accountability. And you're accountable to me and to me alone. And here's what I expect of you. These shall be my statutes. Now, there were not many. He was saying there are going to be, and this is what I require. As long as you can hear my voice, I will guide you and lead you. And when there is error, I will determine the outcome and establish right ruling in the midst of you. But what's required is that you listen and that you choose to do what is right and that you obey. Hallelujah. Now, verse 27, after Marah, they journey from there and they come to a place called Elim, where there are 12 fountains of water and 70 palm trees. And it's there they camp by the waters. And again, looking at a governmental foundation, we see the next step, which Yah is going to do, is establish a government or establish an authority in the midst of them as an authority. So that 12, I believe, represents the 12 disciples of YHUH later on, and then the 70 elders. So we see these even reflecting as or symbolizing leadership. All right, moving on to Exodus chapter 16. On the 15th day of the second month. So again, they're only there for 2 months. After leaving Mitzrayim, they set out from Elim, and now they arrive at the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. Verse 2, the same day as arriving at the wilderness of Sin, all the congregation of Israel grumbled again. And their complaint is against Moshe and Aaron this time, while they're there in the wilderness, expressing a desire to have died in Mitzrayim, where at least they had food. Verse 4, soon after the grumbling in the wilderness, Yahuwah speaks to Moshe, announcing that he will rain bread from heaven again to test their obedience to his law. He also states that on the 6th day, they should gather twice the usual amount. So what's interesting here is that the Sabbath is not quite established, not until verse 23. But here, what he is doing is he's testing their appetites. It's always going to be about their appetites as children, even as the children in the garden. It was about food, right? It was about the appetite of the flesh, to desire a temporal pleasure or a dainty, or that to desire that which is contrary to life. In the day that you eat, you shall die. Even though Yah had provided an abundance of resources for the man and the woman in the garden, there was an abundance, a variety of resources that had seed, that bore in them the pattern to produce after their own kind, that it was replenished, it was perfect, it was good. And all these, you can eat anything you want, but this one limitation, this one thing. So we know that the testing is usually with our limitations and restrictions upon our flesh, because our flesh does not want to be limited and it does not want to be restricted. So oftentimes before Yahweh brings about the fullness of a promise that he has given to us, he will allow us to go through tests that will expose the lusts of our flesh, our temperament, I gotta have it, and see what comes out. The bitterness, the complaining, the lack of faith, the quarrel, all the stuff that comes out of those places. And he will settle us there until we have fully surrendered, yielded to the Ruach. So that when we enter into the promise, well, we don't contend against it. We don't forfeit it. We don't destroy it because our flesh is consuming. Okay. So we see here that their appetites are being tested. And it says here, to see if they will walk in Yahweh's laws, verse 15:26, it said, to see if they will obey. He does this again by placing a restriction on the amount. So he doesn't necessarily explain the Sabbath. Moses does that a little bit later, but just here he's saying, okay, this is part of the custom. It is a statute. It shall be a custom that you gather for 6 days. And on the 6th day, I will give you a double portion. But on the 7th day, you are not to gather. They're not told why. They're just told what they can and cannot do, the limitations. You see that? And they see it again as a restriction, something to be tested. And they do test him many times. Verse 5, the children are tested. And it says, and it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. They're not told why, just that they should. So the word here for prepare is kun, okay, to establish, be established, to store up. And this is not to be done on the Sabbath, but there's a reason. The reason is that Yahweh will provide the provision. He is the provider of the Sabbath. He's the provider of all things, but there's something significant here. Yahweh is saying that on this specific day, I will make provisions, and those provisions being provided by me will demonstrate that I care for you, even on the Sabbath of rest. But I believe there's something far more significant. Let's look. So in verse 6, we see a delineation or a distinction between evening and morning, not day and night, but evening and morning, and how they relate to the Sabbath. For those of you who have questioned, is the Sabbath in the day? Do we start the Sabbath in the evening? I think this chapter and these verses will help define the Sabbath day. So in verse 6, it says, there was the evening in the wilderness of Sin after the announcement. So Moshe tells them, these are the customs, the statutes, by ordinance, by decree of the king. So there's a judgment attached to it. You have to hearken, diligently obey, listen to him, do these things. See it all now? And he says that you are to gather and prepare. And there's a demonstration here. Something is going to be demonstrated. And right after that announcement is made in the evening, Yahweh gives them meat, flesh, quails to eat. And then Moshe says, at evening, at the end of the day, you shall know that Yahweh brought you out from the land of Egypt or bondage. So the evening, he says, you will know that it's going to be a reminder, evening to evening, Pesach at evening. This is a reminder of your freedom, that this is bringing, that he brought you out of Egypt or out of bondage. Verse 7 says, but in the morning is when you shall see the glory of Yahuwah. So giving you quail in the evening is a reminder of your deliverance. But in the morning, and this is symbolic, prophetic even, of when the children of Israel came out of Egypt and they wandered in the 3 days. And I showed you in my Passover presentation how it correlates to the 3 days and the 3 nights that Yahusha was in the grave. Again, his deliverance from the grave was likened to his deliverance, to their deliverance from Mitzrayim. And it was in the morning that he rose. And it was in the morning that Egypt was defeated by Yahuwah there at the sea. Both of them happening on the same, in the same timeline. 3 days they were pursued by death by Egypt, and they face an insurmountable impossibility. How can we go forward? How we will be utterly consumed. So also YHUH is in the grave for 3 nights, 3 days and 3 nights. And on that same night, as the children of Israel were being pursued by the Egyptians, then also YHUH is being pursued by death to hold him down into the grave. But the mighty hand of Yah, the glory of Yahuwah, not only conquers Egypt, but conquers the grave and raises him up on the 3rd day, and the children are released in the morning on the 3rd day. So this is important. So he says, in the evening you shall know that Yahuwah brought you out of the land, out from the land of Egypt, out of bondage, but in the morning you shall see the glory of Yahuwah. And in verse 10, well, guess what the children did? They continued to complain. So even after experiencing this account of deliverance and the glory of Yahuwah, right? And this is just the manna, no Sabbath established yet. A couple of verses later, they have another complaint. And this time their complaint is against Yahuwah. Now, again, we talked about the difference between having a concern and crying out, voicing your concerns, your lack of faith, help my unbelief, being in communication with your provider, with Yahuwah, saying, what shall I do? Where shall I go? Who shall provide? This is actually reflecting your level of faith. You have enough faith to turn to the unseen, to the unknown, right? To turn to him in a moment of distress and to cry out to him. That says a lot about your faith. And still, it's then that Yah is responding. He is motivated to respond to your faith, even in distress. There's a difference between you looking at him for deliverance, for healing, for provision, whatever it is, and crying out in against him, holding a charge against him in contempt, right? That bitterness of that situation is now coming out as you complain against Yahuwah for doing such a thing. And it has a lot to do with our perspective. What are we looking at? Right? Even then, Yahuwah is gracious. Even then, he is patient with us. But what are we looking at? Are we focused on the limitations? Are we focused on the problem? Or are we looking to the waymaker? Are we looking to Yahuwah Rapha, the healer? Are we looking at our Yahuwah Nisi, our banner of strength? What are we looking at? And there are times where we don't know, because maybe we've never encountered him this way. You know, it wasn't until recently that he revealed himself to me as sovereign. I only ever knew him as Abba, Father. And now my Father is revealed to me as the King of Kings, who judges even me. And when those judgments came against me, it was brutal, at least so I thought it was. But now reflecting back, I see that those judgments led to life. It brought correction, discipline, maturity. It made me accountable, and it matured me. He took me from that moral reflection, self-reflection. I'm a child, I'm your child, constantly self-reflecting on my own error. Okay, you know, raise me up in the way that I should go. And now I'm accountable for others. Now I care about how my choices reflect upon others, how I've harmed others. I became accountable for the lives of my interaction with others, my engagement with others. So love your neighbor as yourself. And then now, even beyond that, in a season where he's like, okay, now can you love your enemies? Now, there's always a degree in which we develop in love, mature in love. So yes, even loving your neighbor, it means to love your enemy. Sometimes your neighbor is your enemy, Amalekite, right? Sometimes your neighbors are Amalekites. And when I mean neighbors, I don't mean within close proximity or within the, right there in that vicinity. I'm talking about your neighbors, could be people you work with, your family members, people on social media, however it is that you perceive. Now, you may not always act out in your angst or in your frustration, but Yah is looking upon the heart, and he wants to settle that thing. He wants to remove the callous and the hardness from the heart so that you can flow, so that when you are in the presence of your enemies, you can eat in peace. Okay? Very difficult to have a voracious appetite when you are stressed or when you're surrounded by hostility or confrontation. Most people will lose their appetite. So the fact that David says, you have set for me a table, a buffet in the midst of my enemies, means that that internal peace was present. Okay. So it's interesting, as the children now turn their grumbling and complaints against Moses and Aaron and the leadership towards Yahweh, well, what does Yahweh do? In verse 12, there's a verdict. It says that, and this is Aaron. Aaron is the one that's giving the advisement. He's telling them, this is what you're supposed to do, prepare, and in the evening, and the glory of Yahuwah and all the things. He's right in the middle of this discussion. And it says that the glory of Yahuwah appears in a cloud and interrupts and speaks to Moses and says, listen, all right, listen, this is the verdict. This is the verdict of their complaint. I hear their complaint. Okay, I've heard their charge against me. They think that I'm going to neglect them. So tell them this, that in the evening I will give flesh, and in the morning I will give bread. And by this they shall know that I am Yahweh and that I am their Elohim. So he's not angry per se, but he's saying, I understand, I get it. All they had ever known was Pharaoh and these pseudo gods, their statutes and whatnots. But even I was raining upon Egypt for their sake, but they don't know this. So I will reveal myself to them. Tell them, I will give them food in the evening, and I will give them bread in the morning, and they will know. Verse 14. So in the morning, the dew lies around the camp, and after it goes up, there was a small round substance resembling frost on the ground. The children of Israel, they didn't know what it was, so they called it manna, which in Hebrew means, what is it? And then Moshe tells them, it is the bread Yahweh has given to them to eat. It's important to note that. Bread Yahweh has given. Remember, he says, in the morning you shall see the glory of Yahuwah. In the evening, it shall be a reminder of your deliverance. But in the morning, the glory. Deliverance, evening. He delivered you from the dark. He delivered you from the night, from the darkness, and brought you into the glory of the day, the glorious day, the joy of Yahuwah, right? Joy comes in the morning. So we see something significant here. There's this bread, and it's going to appear in the morning, revealing the glory of Yah. Okay? Well, now, first let's go to Luke 11:3. When YHUH says, and this is how you shall pray, let your kingdom come, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. First thing he says is, give us today our daily bread. So this is, again, he's thanking, recognizing that Yahweh is the source of his vitality, provision, sustenance. I thank him for my daily bread. But who is this bread? Well, John 6:51 tells us that YHUH is this bread of life. And so every time we read from the original covenant given to the children, we should see glimpses of YHUH, foretelling or foreshadowing the substance, the soma, the body, the fullness, as it is prophetically established among the people according to their faith. It brings forth what they were hoping for, salvation. Faith is the evidence of that which is unseen. YHUH was unseen at that time, but their faith was being established And as their faith was being established according to the word of Yah, it eventually brought about the fullness of what they were hoping for. Although some remained blind and they did not see it, even though he was there in the flesh. John 6:51, YHUH says, I am the living bread which came down from heaven, manna from heaven. If any man eats of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And what does he mean by this flesh and bread? Well, John 1:14 says, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, what's interesting there is this is the glory revealed in the day, in the morning, as that daily bread, the bread of life. But the manna, so I researched what it was tasted like, and various verses say different things, but the manna was pretty much ground up and pounded into cakes, which were then baked, resulting in something that tasted like cakes baked with oil, like these fried cakes. But Exodus states that the raw manna, its raw form, tasted like wafers that had been made with honey. It was sweet and coriander, bitter. It was a little sweet and a little bitter. And when it was ground up, it was turned into these sweet honey cakes, like fried honey cakes. Well, Psalm 119, 103 makes sense now when David says, how sweet is your word? How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey, honeycomb in my mouth. So the word of Yahweh is sweet. It may go in bitter, but it's sweet and it nourishes. It's pleasant. John 6:31 through 35. And again, YHUH says that he was the word made flesh and that his word became living bread. John 6:31 through 35. Therefore, YHUH said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, Moshe did not give you the bread out of heaven, but it was my Father who did it, and even now gives you the true bread out of heaven. For the bread of Elohim is he who comes down out of the heaven and gives life to the world. So they said to him, Master, give us this bread always. And YHUH said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger, and he that believes on me shall never thirst. Now, this is perfect because we're talking about sustenance in the wilderness, and the very complaints that they had was for food and for water. Again, John 6:63 says that the spirit, the Ruach of Elohim, gives life, because the flesh, it profits nothing. The words he said that he has spoken, well, they are spirit and they are life. So it's the Ruach that's warring against the flesh here. Yahweh knows that he's dealing with their carnal minds. He's dealing with these fleshly individuals. And we see for 40 years, there is a contest between the spirit and the flesh. That's what this is all about. All throughout the testimonies of the children of Israel, it's about subjugating their flesh to the will of Yah, getting them to desire the sweetness of life, the bread of life and the living waters, that they would desire life, that they would choose life, that in their act of obedience, they would experience life, which is what we, as a byproduct of their faith, get to experience today. They did the hard work so we can make reference to it, so that we can be held accountable. Now, in verse 20 of chapter 16, daily. So Yahweh provided for them daily, 6 days a week for 40 years, and a double portion on the 6th day. So actually for 7 days a week, double portion on the 6th day. For 40 years, they ate manna. the children of Israel gathered that manna every morning, each according to their need. The manna would melt as soon as the sun became hot, but some still disobeyed Moshe, and they would gather more than they needed, and they would leave it until morning, and as a result, it would breed worms and a stench of decay. Now, verse 22. So we see that the instructions of gathering the manna was given, not the Sabbath, not yet, but the gathering. So they're told, this is a statute, an ordinance, and then the law means that there's a judgment if you don't, a verdict already put into motion. On the day that you eat, you shall die, right? So there's the command, the statute, the ordinance, and then the verdict already given, all right? So in verse 22, we see from 20, 21, 22, they still go out, they still gather on the seventh day. And on the sixth day of gathering the manna, it says that they gathered twice as much bread. That was 2 omers per person. And then the rulers went and informed Moshe. So some are, storing it up for the next day. Some are gathering more than they need. And so Moshe realizes, okay, now we're going to institute the reasoning behind it. So in verse 23, it says that the Sabbath day is now instituted. Immediately after the rulers inform Moshe, Moshe explains that the next day, in the day is a Sabbath, and that they should prepare what they need for 2 days on the 6th day, that they lay up the extra manna, and that it would not stink or breed worms because it was preserved for the Sabbath. Now, the word Sabbath, which means to rest or to stop or to cease from work. Now, the origin of the Shabbat goes back to creation. After creating the heavens and the earth in 6 days, Yahuwah rested on the 7th day from all of his work which he had made, Genesis 2:2. This does not mean that Yahuwah was tired or fatigued or exhausted and needed a rest. We know that he is omnipotent, literally all-powerful. His power is all-sufficient. It does not cease because there is no death in him. Okay, so his power is not diminished. He does not expire. His power does not expire. So what does it mean that Yahuwah rested on the 7th day? Well, it simply means that he finished perfecting his will. He accomplished his will. It was perfected, complete, lacking no good thing, which is why every time he completed a segment, he said, it was good. It was complete. It was perfect. It lacked nothing. The only time that he does not make this claim is when he creates the man. And he says instead, it is not good because he's alone. So it was not complete. But when he made the woman, the man became complete, lacking nothing, whole, perfect, for a purpose. And his purpose was that they would be fruitful and multiply. So the woman completes the man and perfects Yah's will such that they can do exactly that, be fruitful and multiply. So Yah is all-powerful. He's sufficient. So he did not rest because he was fatigued, but he rested because he finished perfecting his will. He accomplished his will. Now, the various elements of Sabbath symbolize the coming of Messiah, who would provide a permanent rest for his people, a day when the curse for disobedience in Genesis 3:19, remember, in sorrow, Adam, by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your bread. Well, the Messiah will provide a day of relief where that disobedience, the curse of disobedience, will now become the blessing of obedience. Yahuwah's plan of salvation includes his provision and our need for it. So it's not just about being saved from sin and death, but the plan of salvation is that we learn that we were created to be dependent, not independent. Our independence leads to death. Our dependency upon him leads to life. 1 Corinthians 11:24, YHUH says, take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. And again, in Matthew 11:28 through 29, he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. That Itzaban, in sorrow, you have labored for your bread. But come on to me, take my body, which is broken from you, take upon my yoke and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Now, again, that dependence on Yahweh is vital for experiencing the element of our salvation. The fullness is as we're maturing, but even now we experience that. Why? Because Yahweh is the source of life. So being dependent on him means that we are, in order to experience life, which is salvation from death, from sin that causes death, the payment rewards us with death. We say, I am utterly dependent upon you, the source of life, to maintain, to abide, to maintain vitality. The Sabbath rest was, and I'll say is, a privilege that most cannot afford. They could not afford it back then. Although other nations had similar institutions, they were not complete days of rest and usually required a tribute or offering to be made to the head of state on that day. Verse 25, the seventh day is the Sabbath. Moshe tells them, not you shall work for 6 days and rest on the seventh, not yet, but the institution was you shall gather for 6 days, and on the seventh you shall not gather. So it's very simple. So Moshe tells them to eat the stored manna and not to gather in the field, which would later, when they come into the land of Canaan and possess it, then they will institute the labor. That's that part of that reaping and sowing. Okay, we'll look at this again in greater detail, but for now, let's keep it simple. Even though he explains, now, here's what you're to do and here's why. Part of the statutes, the ordinances of Yahweh. Still, some people would go out and gather on the seventh day, even though he told them no, and they found none. So now in this case, because they're fully accountable, Yahweh rebukes Moshe about the people's refusal to obey his commands and his laws. So the people finally rest on the seventh day. Verse 32, after a period of eating manna, Yahuwah commands Moshe to tell Aaron to take a pot, put an omer of manna in it, and set it before Yahweh to keep for future generations as a remembrance. And Aaron does. Exodus 17, after a period of time in the wilderness of Sin, all the congregation sets out on their journey from the wilderness, following the direction of Yahweh. They arrive at Rephidim, they camp there, but again, there is no water for the people to drink. So we see something here: food, water, Sabbath, rest, food, water, manna, water, rest. Verse 3, now in Rephidim, the people again strive and grumble. So we see another pattern, spirit versus flesh, against Moshe, demanding water and questioning now why he, not Yahweh, but why did you bring us from Mitzrayim to die of hunger and thirst? So as a result, they now threaten to stone Moshe. So it's like things aren't even getting better, right? It's like their heart is becoming even more hardened. Why? So what does Philippians say? Chapter 3, 18 through 19. Now, again, of course, Paul is talking about those who are accosting him and challenging them and threaten to stone him, right? Because remember, this was a real threat. They threatened to kill him, to stone him. He says, listen, he's writing to the assembly in Philippi. So he's writing to them and he says, for many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Mashiach, whose end is destruction. Why? What makes them the enemy? Listen, whose Elohim, whose God is their belly, and whose glory, remember the glory will be in the morning, whose glory is in their shame. Why? Because they mind earthly things, worldly things. They are carnal minded. These are the enemies. This is what was working. The flesh was constantly striving, constantly grumbling, complaining, and holding Yahweh and his leadership in contempt. They complained continually, revealing their lack of faith. The flesh does not believe because it is carnal minded, it is earthly centered. They revealed their lack of faith and trust through their despair. They had a tendency to look to Moses, the arm of the flesh, as the source, as their source and provider, which was even more dangerous because, again, the arm of the flesh will fail you. But as human beings, we have a tendency to do this, to look to our income, to look to our spouses, to look to our resources, our employers, the structures over our head, the government, resources, educations, and all sorts of things to provide a sense of safety. And when those things are challenged, we're disturbed. Fear sets in, anxiety sets in. Oh no, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? I mean, again, it's normal to some degree. It's when we stay in that place and it leads us to remember one of the definitions of Marah. Let me go back there for a second as we look at this word for Marah, the mixture, flesh and spirit, right? You can't have a mixture, but it says here represents a character of death, describes a person as hot-tempered, discontented, provoked, anguished, ruthless. So we know that bitterness is working in them if they would now desire to stone the very one who liberated them. So that same day, Moshe cries out unto Yahweh again. He instructs, so we see this again, a pattern juxtaposing. Moshe crying out to Yahweh and the children crying out against, right? So Moshe cries out to Yahweh and he instructs him to go before the people with some elders taking his rod and to strike the rock at Horeb. He does. And he does this before the elders, and water does in fact come out and the people drink. The place there is then named Marah and Meribah due to the people's strife and trying. So we see they're trying him. And again, it's necessary, right? Because they don't know him very well. Now, what's interesting is that the word Masha or Masa means testing, and Meribah, believe it or not, means bitter contention from the compound two words, mar, bitter, and rib, to strive. And they say, is Yahweh among us or not? So again, God's grace more than sufficient for them. Why? Because he knows that they do not know how to distinguish his presence. Plus, they're also learning, they're going to learn to distinguish between the arm of the flesh. Some are going to learn, not all, but the arm of the flesh, which Moses represents, and Yahuwah. And even with Yahusha, as he comes as the right hand of Yahuwah, the arm of the flesh, it was always that not me, him. Not me, him. I do what the Father does. I say what the Father says. Yahusha says, I point, I'm the hand that points to the Father. So also, again, the idea is that we become dependent on the Ruach of Elohim, that we learn to yield and be submitted to the power of the Ruach working in us. That's it, right? Because some, believe it or not, there is going to be an anti-Messiah, whatever that looks like. But there will be one who will rise up in the midst of it all. And there has been many, actually. And he, again, the arm of the flesh, and people will say he is a Messiah, if not the Messiah, a Messiah, and that he will deliver us. And so I think the enemy takes advantage of this loophole in which he can present himself. All right. So while they are still there in Rephidim, Amalek comes and fights with Israel. In verse 9, the same day as the fight with Amalek begins, Moshe instructs Yeshua to choose men and fight Amalek the next day. Moshe, Aaron, and Hur go up to the top of the hill. The rod of YHUH is in Moshe's hand, and this is how he prevails. And again, it just makes me think of Yahusha as the rod, that rod of authority, or the right hand, the scepter that's Yahusha, right? Again, pointing to Yahusha. Now, finally, in verse 11, following the day of the battle, Moshe stands on the hilltop with the rod of Elohim. When he holds up his hand, Israel prevails. When he lowers his hand, Amalek prevails. Again, juxtaposing the strength of Yahweh's supernatural and the weakness of the flesh. And in our weakness, your strength is made perfect, right? So we see this contrast, and we're supposed to see how the flesh is weak when it comes to exhibiting or demonstrating faith according to Yah's will or his word. When we put it to work in the flesh, it can has a little bit of fatigue, but when it's in the ruach, we have victory. We the impossible becomes possible. And so he eventually they provide a rock for him to sit on, and they hold his hands up for him. And eventually Aaron and Hur support Moshe's hands until sunset. Again, sunset, we see deliverance at evening. Now, by the end of the battle, Yeshua defeats Amalek and his people with the sword. Verse 14, after the battle, Yahweh instructs Moshe to write about the victory over Amalek. And remember, when something is written, we looked at for whether it's for a memorial or for a declaration or a decree, but in this case, it is a decree. I want to bring it back here. Order of decree. So by order, I declare that you established the act of proclaiming or writing it. And so we see that here as Yahweh tells him to write this as a decree, to write about the victory for remembrance, and to recite to Joshua, stating that he will blot out the remembrance of Amalek. Now in 15, Moshe builds a slaughter place or an altar and calls it Yahweh Nisi, declaring that Yahweh will fight against Amalek from generation to generation. Now the word Nisi is basically a signal, a token, a banner that represents a cause or a person. Now, when it's placed on the altar, the banner acted as a reminder of Yahweh's might. When it was lifted up, it called the people together for battle, for a meeting, or even for instruction. This is before the shofars. Now, Moses erected an altar to honor the El of victory, pointing forward to Yahusha being placed on the same altar of victory, the banner over on the altar. 40 years after leaving Mizraim, the children of Israel continue to eat manna until they reach an inhabited land known as Canaan, specifically those borders. Now it's interesting because in 1 John 2:15 through 17, Yahusha says, and this is summarizing all that we've just learned, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. For if any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So again, Yahweh is merciful, compassionate, patient with them because he knew that the love for him was not in them. They didn't know him, so they didn't love him. But he was really looking forward to King David, where there would be a time where they would. For all that is in the world, the lust, the appetite of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that does the will of Elohim abides forever. And let's look at Yahusha now. In John 4:34, Yahusha explained, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Shabbat, rest. That death that he experienced, although it was brutal externally, internally, it was the eternal rest. It was the completion of something. It is finished, perfected. Salvation is perfected. There is now an end from the beginning. It is complete in me. He says that his food is to do the will, to finish it, and he finished the race. So he is the bread of life. For he says, I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but to do the will of him who sent me. John 4:34. And his Father's will has always been to send forth the word, that he would become flesh and feed his people, that he would rain down from heaven as living water and nourish them, give them something to drink, and give them something to eat, revive them, bring them home. John 17:4 says, I have glorified you on earth, Father, by accomplishing the work you gave me to do. Beautiful summary of that water and that bread and that day of rest, showing us the salvation of Yahusha as he is the bread and the water and the rest that we enter into, and we take upon ourselves the yoke, the burden, such a light yoke, such a light burden, and we learn of him. All right, we're going to conclude with just a summary. I thought these were some really cool keynotes here. Israel in the wilderness, the provision and the testing. So there was some divine provision and testing. It was a central theme throughout these chapters, as Yahuwah's consistent provision for the needs of the children of Israel in the wilderness, and even in challenging circumstances. This provision serves as a test of their faith and obedience to his commands. Remember that next time you are put in a situation where there is no resources. As stated in the bread from heaven section, Yahuwah says, I am raining bread from the heavens for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day in order to try them, whether they will walk in my laws or not. I love that the Sister Maggie pointed out that that portion, there is the word dabar, meaning daily bread, is also akin to the daily word, dabar in Hebrew. The word that's used there in that verse is dabar, word, your daily. You got to get into the word daily. Another thing, you can't store it up, okay? That has to be digested. You have to acclimate. You have to digest that information, meditate, chew on it, chew on it, chew on it until you receive a revelation or understanding, till your eyes are open and you can see clearly what is true. You chew on it. We don't become fat in the spirit thinking that we're storing up knowledge, because that knowledge will putrefy and rot and decay. Knowledge puffs up, bloats, okay? But the word keeps you lean and fit, okay, so that you can continue to run that race. You got to chew on it. You got to study. You got to do the work, engage in that chew mechanics, okay? The people's grumbling and lack of trust. Despite facing miraculous deliverance and ongoing divine support, the children of Israel repeatedly exhibit a lack of trust in Yahuwah and grumble against Moshe and Aharon. This is evident at Marah, and the people grumbled against him, saying, what do we drink? What do we eat? And all the congregation of the children of Israel grumbled against Moshe. Therefore, the people strove with him. All right, so we know that that is a byproduct of being in the flesh, being immature, childish, but I want to, mommy. Again, grace, mercy, compassion. How do we then deal with those who are still immature in their faith or who are still fleshy? We need to have the same patience, and the same endurance that Yahuwah and Moshe oftentimes failed, but exhibited towards the children. Yahuwah's responsiveness and mercy. And that's really what we want to see here. Despite the people's grumbling, Yahuwah consistently heard their cries and provides for their needs, demonstrating his mercy and faithfulness to his promises. This is seen in the healing of the bitter waters at Marah and the provision of manna and quail in the wilderness of Shin. Now, the importance of obedience and the Sabbath, highlighting the significance of obeying Yahuwah's commands, particularly regarding the gathering of manna. Now, remember, we're looking at two views here. Anthropocentric, anthro meaning self-sufficiency. You're centered on self or centered on man, and the observance of the Sabbath, which is theocentric dependency, theocentric, centered on Yah. Okay, so we either have an anthropocentric view, which means our own sufficiency or man's sufficiency, or we have a theocentric view, which means that we are dependent on him. The instruction for the sixth day emphasizes preparation and resting on the seventh. And the consequences of disobeying this command are shown. And they did not listen to Moshe, so some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank. The passage explicitly links the provision of manna to the Sabbath. Why? Because Yahweh has given you the Sabbath, he says. Therefore, he is giving you provision. So this carries a promise of provision. Think about that. Yah's provision. When we keep the Sabbath, we have a theocentric dependency. Our dependency is centered on him, which means literally his words. He says, because I have given you the Sabbath, therefore, he says, I will give you provision. So when we choose to obey him and rest on the Sabbath, we are revealing our theocentric dependency. We are saying that we are completely dependent on him, such that we have the privilege of resting. And in this, we trust that he will provide, not mammon, not man, okay? But he will give us our daily bread. He will make sure that we are tended to and cared for and nourished, so that we can continue to do his will and finish the work that he has given to us. Finally, the testing of faith. The experiences in the wilderness are explicitly described as tests of the people's faith and the establishment of their commitment to Yahweh. So he's laying a foundation, right? Laying a foundation, putting their faith, a seed, the mustard, the little coriander seed, small little seed of faith is being planted. In these circumstances, seeds of faith are being planted. At Marah, there he made a law and right ruling for them, and he tried them. In the wilderness of Sin, the daily gathering of manna was in order to try them, whether they would walk in his Torah or not. At Rephidim, he says the people's strife and questioning, is Yahweh in our midst or not, is also described as because they tried him. So we see that in Marah, at Sin, and at Rephidim, each situation, Yahweh gives them a law and right rulings, and there he tried them. Yahweh gave them manna, and there they tried him. And Yahweh, they questioned Yahweh, is he with us? And it says that they tried him. So this was, again, an example of their lack of faith and the insecurity of their commitment. And what is the consequence of unbelief? And again, Yahweh is displaying, he's showing them something they wouldn't know otherwise unless these situations had arose. The consequence of unbelief, implicit. While not the primary focus, the negative outcomes of disobedience and lack of trust are hinted at, such as the rotting manna, when the command to not leave any overnight was ignored. Matthew 4:4 says, It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word. Remember, he is the word, he's the manna from heaven, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. And if you will diligently listen, Shema, hear my words. Deuteronomy 8:3 again says to them, he humbled you, and in your hunger, he gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had known, so that you might understand that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of Yahweh. And again, Jeremiah 15:16, your words were found and I ate them. Your words became my joy in the morning and my heart's delight. For I bear your name, O Yahweh, El of hosts, Sabaoth. And finally, we see Yahweh as protector. Now, in response to, is Yahweh even with us? Which was their final cry or protest against him. Yahweh then responds by allowing the Amalekites to challenge Israel. Now, again, depending on your perspective, that will determine how you perceive this. My perspective, I could see Yahweh's grace in all of this. The way that I saw it was not a punishment, but Yah's grace giving them a response, building their faith, showing himself up every single time. Not that it would produce, because there was always this tension, but not that our grumbling and complaints and our bitterness would produce any good thing. But in the midst of it, we see Yah being patient, because love is patient. So guess what? They say, is Yah even with us? And how does he respond? The Amalekites. Well, then they all of a sudden go and challenge Israel. And you would think they would say, oh, they're going to kill us, right? But it's here again, Yahweh is introducing himself. He is courting Israel. He is pursuing Israel. He's courting her. And he introduces himself as Yahweh Nisi, the protector of Israel in battle against their enemies. Through Moshe's intercession, the people will now taste victory, which is Yahweh's ultimate provision. Victory, taste and see. So that pretty much sums up my overview of these chapters. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will open up for comments and questions or discussion. But for now, I'll go ahead and say goodbye and log off. Yah be with you. Shalom.